focus right now will be on the core territories. So Australia is our newest kind of core territory, and that's because of all the kind of 60 million listens we're kind of crunching every month. We've seen that Australia and Canada kind of vie for kind of 4 and 5 position in content we've already signed globally. So the data was telling us that Australia was naturally the next market for us to progress into. And interestingly, versus Canada and some of the other territories, we saw growth in the Australian market from listens we'd signed outside Australia happening faster than anywhere else. So you could see there was a tipping point in how the consumer appetite for podcasting was building here. So the focus certainly for the next 12 months will be on the kind of core markets, which is the US, UK, Nordics, and Australia, and then we will look to build out from that. India and Asia are both interesting markets, potentially, but I think nascent at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you've been studying the data, so you can see that Australians are consuming your podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any kind of business decision we make, particularly in terms of expansion, there's one way of doing it, which is kind of waving your finger in the air and going, actually, I think that's a territory we should invest in. The other is to actually look at the data, and if you strip it back, we're a tech company and a data business underneath it, and the data was telling us that actually consumption within a given period of time was happening disproportionately faster than anywhere else.
Any ideas or instinct why it is that our Australians are interested in podcasts in general and your content?
I think it's two things. One, to which kind of Guy and Henrik have alluded to earlier, there is a radio market here that is stronger than ever. And I think podcasting is ancillary to that. It's on demand, it's catch up. So you're educating people about the power of audio through radio. That doesn't need to be done. People are hungry for more additional content from people whose opinion they value. And podcasting is satisfying that need within the Australian market, I think, as well. At the same time, we look at things like Audiocraft. If you're kind of familiar with kind of the conference for kind of independent kind of audio creators, there's an indie scene bubbling away here. And again, a lot of our kind of data tells us that shows like kind of Sanspants, which is kind of a network that we signed out of the UK, but is an Australian network. You can see those people actually starting to find a real footing with their audience. And what we want to do is help amplify those shows, make that next My Dad Wrote a Porno, but that comes out of Australia, that's homegrown but is a global smash hit. And I think I feel confident that's something that will happen.
Yeah, that is probably your biggest, most well-known product, My Dad Wrote a Porno. Is that the one that's getting the most listens in Australia?
It is at the moment, yes. I mean, when it kind of returns for kind of season 4 next year, it'll make a significant difference. But I think what's interesting is how it's resonated globally. Yeah. And one of the things we want to achieve in Australia is that kind of homegrown hit that flies globally. And porno is an example of something that I feel is kind of quintessentially English often in its sense of humour, and the Australians and the English share, I think, a kind of common sense of humour there as well. But it also resonates in the States in a way that the Americans view how the English look at comedy in that kind of Benny Hill, sort of Frankie Howard nod to a genre. You know, I feel that same sentiment, that same sense of a view on the world will come out of Australia as well. So I think that's part of the reason for its success.
Guy?
Yeah, I was going to say the other reason podcasting is doing so well here is Australia has a rich heritage of storytelling, and there's some amazing stories from this market that are already being told and are finding a great audience case file, yes. It being a really, really big and well-known example. And one of the things that I'm hugely excited about in this role is helping to uncover more of those great stories and more really talented storytellers. And I think the other thing Australia has to its advantage is a unique curiosity in other markets. People in the UK, people in the US are very interested in what's happening here because of the cultural similarities, but also the cultural differences. There's unique flora and fauna here. It's a country that captivates the rest of the English-speaking world. So I think we're going to be able to unearth some really talented Australian podcasters and help them build a much more global profile.
And Adam, you work with talent as Chief Content Officer of the whole company, and Guy, I guess that'll be your job here in Australia as well. What kind of talent does it take to make a good podcast? Are they different from radio talent?
That's a really good question. It's a very broad way to answer it. I'll turn it around a little bit if I can. One of the questions we often get asked is, what's the optimal length for a podcast? And the answer is always as long as it needs to be. Yeah. And I think the same kind of applies to talent. It's about having that engaged audience. I think, to follow Guy's point, it's about having a story that you're passionate about. If there's anything we know about audio, is it's a truly intimate atmosphere. It's not video. Once we've put those kind of headphones on, we're engaged in the storytelling. We talk about the theatre of the mind and everything that kind of audio enables. So a strong story is what captivates people, whether that subject is true crime, mindfulness, well-being, health. That doesn't matter as much. It's about the passion and the authenticity in storytelling.
And I think also like one of the best, Sandspans is a great example, I think, in Australia, Sandspans Radio Network, is that they're so passionate about what they produce and make. And I think that really shines through in the content that they produce, and they do it over and over again because of that very reason. And that also turns to the previous question about where do you start making a podcast and how do you start. I think that's a brilliant example. Choose a subject that you're passionate about, that you like, and I think the rest will follow. And I think that's the easiest way to do that.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things I love about podcasting is its ability to bring cultural niches and subcultures together. If you're passionate about something and evangelical about something, there's a good chance you're going to find an audience of like-minded individuals who share that passion, and that's going to be both in Australia and globally. So really the best place to get started is find your passion and go out there and create some great content about it.
That's the amazing thing about the internet, the ability to search, sort and find things that you're interested in, just transcending geography.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me about the logistics of making a successful podcast, not just Acast, but in general. You know, what have you learnt about the logistics? Do you need a website? Is a mobile app better? Do you need both? Should you put podcast content on all platforms or only on your own platform?
It's part of why we came into being as a company. When we kind of looked at podcasting, particularly in the Nordics and Sweden, where we've kind of begun as a business, we could see that there's an absolute disconnect between the creators and the passion to tell a story and the knowledge of how to get that story out there if it's a podcast. So what we've come along as a business is to fill that gap for people, to make it as frictionless as possible for the creator to actually upload a file in one place, a single point of distribution, and for that to travel as far and wide as it possibly may be. That's distributing it seamlessly to all the existing podcasts and Apple Podcasts and all the kind of competitors within that space, but also delivering audio and snippets of audio into social environments so that actually you can cut a little piece of your show and push it very easily into Twitter or to Instagram or to Facebook, and that's your way of hooking in a new audience without requiring them to invest in a 45-minute piece of content. So I think trying to solve that technology problem of creators with the ideas thinking, how do I get my audio out there? That's what we've come along as a business to do.
Yeah. What's the most powerful platform? Is it your own Acast platform or is it iTunes?
It's iTunes, definitely, in the moment. It still dominates in terms of kind of consumption. It definitely has the kind of broadest library of content, I think, and it kind of sits atop the pile, having kind of created podcasting and laying ownership to the world, is in a very powerful position to do that. I mean, what we see is that the majority of consumption or discovery is still happening through iTunes, basically. But ironically, that's people squinting at a tiny thumbnail of some cover art for a show they've never heard of and making a judgment call on that. So the discovery problem has still not been fully solved by people like Apple and others, and I think is something that will need to be developed further in the future.
I like the idea of social discovery because I've been banging on about that for a while. I think it's really important that audio is on social media far more than it currently is, because people are there, they're trawling those platforms and they will discover things from there. So somebody makes a podcast, you discover some talent, they use your platform to upload it easily. What happens then? Does it automatically then just get placed on iTunes? Your logistics do all that?
Yeah, so for the iTunes library you have to register your RSS feed essentially, but once you've done that, all of the other podcatchers, so Pocket Cast here, Downcast, Overcast, they will index iTunes and pick up the show, so your show will automatically appear in all of those other libraries. So it's a fairly simple process in terms of what we're doing, and what we endeavour to do is give those creators a real perspective on where that show is being played and ideally by who, and they use that information to help craft a better show so that you can see what people drop in and out of your show, which platforms they're sharing your show on over above others, and by using that data you can refine and make your better show and tailor it to your audience.
And can you get the analytics from iTunes? They're notoriously bad at sharing data.
I'm cautious on the bad when with regards to Apple. They're certainly making strides in the right direction, and I think come December or thereabouts, there's going to be an announcement about opening up some of that data and sharing it with platforms like Acast and others. And I think that's going to be very telling for the industry as a whole. I think it's going to give people a real sense of actually what consumption habits are, for the length of period that people are actually consuming, and more importantly, at what times of the day. And I think the more data we can bring into this industry, the better. You know, the data is the piece we package up and ultimately be able to sell to advertisers to match those two things together. So the more data points we have in this industry, the better. So what Apple is doing, I think, is going to be a great initiative.
Talking of data points, then let's talk about listening habits. I agree with you. I think the length is as long as the podcast needs to be interesting. But one of the things that's emerged over the last few years when looking at statistics is that people will listen for a certain short time, and if you can get them over that hump, then they'll almost always finish the podcast.
Yes.
And I've heard, variations of that time, like 30 seconds, but then 5 minutes, 7 minutes. What are you finding is the tipping point for people to stay listening and listen to the end?
Depends on the content. Right. I mean, what we see with branded content, for instance, is that the more niche it tends to get. So we did a campaign together with Nova Entertainment, which was the launch of an IVF clinic called Janaea. Again, a very, very niche subject, and the listen-through rate that Adam was talking about before was almost 100%. And this is a 20-minute podcast, and it's a producer and a host interviewing doctors and patients who've been through an IVF process. But then again, if we look at evergreen content like news content, we do see a different type of behavior, as in people don't tend to listen to the whole thing. But if we look at comedy, My Dad Wrote a Porno, I suppose, is the best example. The listen-through rate is almost 100% for every single person because they're so engaged with the listening. So I think the answer to it is depends on the content.
I think to Henrik's point, episodic content is going to guarantee a much more successful listen-through rate. People will engage, people want to know what's coming next, and they want to kind of make sure they're tuning back in for the next part of that story. So there are multiple approaches to podcasting, multiple approaches to storytelling. And again, one of the benefits of a platform like Acast is it enables podcasters to really explore the data and really understand what is working and what isn't working, and make those decisions as it relates to growing their audience and growing their listenership.
That's so important for any producer of audio on any platform to understand the audience and the audience listening habits. Your competition here in Australia, Podcast One, has been here with another rival network to Nova for some time. There's the Australian-made Whooshka app, and our national broadcaster ABC have relaunched ABC Listen just recently. So there's a fair bit of competition in the market. How are you going to handle that?
I can answer that. Yeah. I think it's very much like what music streaming was 5-6 years ago in Australia. There's a lot of players like Audio, Apple Music, Spotify, Pandora, Mog, which was another JV between a few different businesses as well. At this stage, I think it's good for everyone. The more noise we can make in this industry, and the more money we can bring back into the industry, the more we will all benefit, especially from a content perspective and creation of content. The businesses per se, Acast, Podcast One and Whooshka, are all very different. Acast is a true technology business. We don't produce any content, which I know that many of the other businesses do. We banked and placed our bets on creating the best technology there is in the world. And I think that's really paid off in other markets, especially in the US, UK and in Europe. And I don't think it's going to be any different here, to be honest. We build the best technology, and then content will follow. The more data we can bring back to content creators and publishers, the better we're all off.
Of the technologies you're building, would it be true to say that most listening is happening on smartphone apps now?
Absolutely. So we see, in Australia specifically, 89% of consumption happens on a smartphone. And 76% of podcast consumption, audio on demand, happens on iTunes today. Spotify are making great strides in this space, and they're venturing into podcasting as well, which again is really, really good. But iTunes is the primary source, and most of that happens on your smartphone.
Can you tell at what time of day people are listening?
Yes, absolutely. So
What is it, the morning run or the afternoon gym session?
actually, it depends on the content. So let's use Kate, Tim and Marty, which is one of Nova's flagship shows. What we've seen there, which is really interesting, and also a correlation to radio, I think, is that they make almost like a cut-down version of the show every day, released 5 times a week in a podcast format. The show is 55 minutes long. What we see through Acast data is the consumption of that show podcast happens between 5 a.m. and say 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., which I think arguably could say that replaces or adds on that morning drive time commute. If you look at other types of content or different types of audiences, so to speak, so this might be someone who normally doesn't drive in a vehicle, might take the bike into work or might take the train. But if you look at different types of content, I'm going to use Sandspan's radio now as an example. What we see is that listening happens predominantly at night, so replaces that linear TV kind of consumption. People come home, they want to listen to something they're passionate about, and that's kind of where it takes off.
That's interesting because we know of radio that's similar. I mean, there's commuting times, and there's also niche listening times where if a person is listening to radio, it's probably because there's a specialist topic that they love, otherwise they'd be just watching television.
That's right. And I think also very interesting enough when it comes to audio on demand or podcasting versus radio with radio is that podcasting tends to be something that you do on your own. You focus, you tend to seek out the information that you want to listen to, you seek out the shows that you want to listen to. Whilst radio, I think, is very, very different. It's something that you listen to entertain yourself, you might listen to it in the car or in the office. And I think from a planning or advertising perspective, that's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Well, you've touched on advertising. It's back to the money question. So how can advertisers monetize the platform, and how can the podcast makers get a share of that?
So what we've built, and I think Acast has revolutionized the way podcast advertising works, to be honest. The way we know podcast advertising is a host doing a live read or a sponsorship at the beginning of the show saying, "Hi, this show is brought to you by brand X, and I'm very grateful for that, thank you very much," and then we move on. That's all well and good, and I think it really works. It's showed some great effect for advertisers in the past. But what we see now that advertisers are a lot more savvy, so baking in your ad into a show is not necessarily the best thing to do because it sticks there, it sits there forever. We've built something we call a dynamic advertising stack or dynamic audio stack, meaning that we can put ads into one show or multiple shows, sponsorships or airtime ads, so to speak, dynamically, and remove them when the offer isn't in market.
So it's pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right. So same type of format, but again done dynamically, meaning that we can also make sure that your message isn't in market when it's not relevant to consumers.
How many advertisers do you have taking advantage of that across your whole platform?
In Australia at the moment, we're probably up to 50, I would say, Australian local ones. We've again we are banking a lot of our technology and automation because the way that audio is being traded today by agencies and brands is very much programmatically, so that's one thing. And something that I don't think radio has really solved yet, especially in Australia. So we do automate a lot of the buying today, so we have advertisers inquiring every single day that we actually don't even see. We get a check at the end of the month. But we are working with the likes of McDonald's, Qantas in this region, CSU. A lot of universities have shown a lot of interest in this as well.
I worry about programmatic advertising, that it's a race to the bottom for cutting rates lower and lower and lower.
Yeah.
Is that a factor?
I think for some industries it is, especially within digital. So if we look at digital display, for instance, mobile display more importantly, it's definitely a race to the bottom. And I think it's been a way for publishers to monetize every single impression on their website. The way that I view this, or we view this at Acast, is that we just want to make sure that the barriers of entry or barriers of transaction are as low as possible. Our rate card in terms of programmatic versus trading the old-fashioned way are the same. There's no difference at all, and it's not going to change at all. We still charge a premium for everything that we sell because we consider our content being the best.
That's great, and I know that in this market, Kathy O'Connor, the CEO of Nova, and the whole commercial radio industry have been very careful about moving into programmatic buying in a way that's not forcing ad rates down.
And it doesn't necessarily have to mean, I think within audio, it is a premium format. It is very different to display, and I think it's also different to video, which today is kind of something that everyone wants to buy, or every brand wants to buy. And programmatic doesn't necessarily have to mean that we're going to commoditize and lower the rates. It doesn't have to be that way. Some publishers and content creators are doing it, but it's certainly nothing that we're going to do.
It's really just a different way of transacting. It's as simple as that. That's right.
Last question about rights. Music rights are very difficult. They're specific to certain geographies. How do you handle rights for music that's in the podcasts, or do you just not put it in?
I'll leave that to Adam. I would probably assume that we don't put them in.
Yeah, we don't put them in, and we don't work with music-specific podcasts. So yeah, electronic dance music is a huge genre in podcasting, but actually from a rights perspective and the music publishers, it's not something we can kind of go near. So on the whole, we put the onus on the podcasters, having cleared rights for any original music themselves. But historically, we don't tend to distribute music-specific shows.
Mm-hmm. So rights owners have certainly got more aggressive about enforcing their rights. We see on YouTube, for instance, if you put something up, then if it matches to someone's music that has a copyright registration, then YouTube will notify you and not upload it. I can only see that music will need to be in podcasts in the future. So are you working on some kind of way to build in some sort of rights tracking in case it's needed in the future?
We have a partnership with a company called Epidemic Sound, who provide a vast kind of library of music excerpts, original music excerpts that are commissioned by them. It's a Swedish startup, so somebody we kind of know in Stockholm, and interestingly somebody we're going to be sharing an office with in New York as well, so kind of flying the Nordic flag. But we make that service available to all of our podcasters, so they know that if they want to access any music, original music for their show, that it's absolutely cleared and it's come via Epidemic Sound.
Mm-hmm. We've talked mostly about the Australian market, but a little bit about the Asian market for our readers on Asia Radio today. So you mentioned you had some targets in Asia. What are they? Where are the Asians going to see Acast popping up?
Well, we've been looking tentatively, so it's very kind of early steps, and I think getting established here in Australia is kind of is a core kick-off point for that, and looking more in depth at the Asian market. So I can't talk too broadly to the specifics of it right now. We have looked briefly at kind of China and India, both as kind of very nascent markets in terms of audio on demand, and seeing what the expectation is there. In those territories, it tends to be looking beyond radio and actually sometimes looking at kind of an audiobooks market and seeing what the transaction is there, and not just thinking with a podcast mentality, thinking with an audio on demand mentality. And per your point earlier, once you see that kind of adoption of the smartphone, it's actually what sort of audio do people want to consume through that, and that's time-shifted radio, podcasts, audiobooks, has yet to be kind of designated kind of genres within that. So it's early stages right now. I don't see a huge native kind of appetite for podcasting specifically in those territories. I think it's very fragmented. I think for us right now, the focus is definitely going to be our core markets and look at Asia as and when it kind of comes into sharper focus.
When you do turn your focus to Asia, will you be looking at the same kind of strategy, partnering with radio networks?
Yes, I think what we're doing with the Nova partnership here in Australia is key. It's the first time we've entered a territory by doing a sales partnership with a local, well-established and well-regarded kind of incumbent in the radio space. I think that's absolutely a model we'll be looking to replicate as we expand further.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.